Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Yeah.
You guys sent in this piece on Tucker Carlson and his interview with Sergey Lavrov, and well, I gotta admit, it caught my eye too.
Yeah.
Especially with the analysis we got from this former FSB analyst.
Oh.
This guy's now in the West, which makes it even more.
Interesting?
Yeah, exactly. We're talking about Carlson, right? This media figure who's become, how do we put it politely, controversial?
Yeah.
Interviewing Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister. Like, on the surface, it's just an interview, two guys talking.
Right.
But I think a lot of people are looking at this and wondering if there's maybe something a little more to it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really valid point, especially when you consider Carlson's background. You've probably been following his career.
Oh,
And
yeah.
So, he's sort of cultivated this very specific audience, right?
Yeah.
One that tends to be a little more maybe distrustful of mainstream narratives. And the analyst we're looking at suggests that this audience aligns really well with the kind of people that Russia often targets with their propaganda.
Okay, so that's a little unsettling when you put it like that. I mean, we've all seen how effective these disinformation campaigns can be.
Oh, absolutely. And the analyst actually brings up a really fascinating point here. They argue that Russia isn't just putting out, generic pro-Kremlin messages. They're actually tailoring their disinformation campaigns very carefully to exploit those existing anxieties and grievances that people already have.
It's almost like they're...
They actually compare it to a mafia operation,
Wow.
which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
It's about control, leveraging weaknesses.
So it's not just about spreading information, it's about manipulating specific groups of people.
Exactly. And, they go even further. They claim that if there were any real diplomacy happening in Russia, there wouldn't be a war in Ukraine.
Okay.
They're suggesting that this whole system is built on this facade of governance.
So, like, what we see isn't really what's happening.
Right. What appears to be these diplomatic processes are really just a cover, according to the analyst, for a power structure that's dominated by oligarchs and these elites.
So we've got this potential for manipulation. We've got a Russian system that may not be what it seems. And then, into all of this, steps Sergey Lavrov, right? A figure who, I mean, if we're being honest here, has been denying Russia's intentions in Ukraine for years.
Yeah, for years.
Our sources say something like almost 300 days of denials leading up to the invasion.
Yeah, that's what makes this whole interview so interesting, right? You have someone like Lavrov with this track record of denials being given a platform by Carlson, who again has this large audience, many of whom are already predisposed to distrusting official narratives.
Yeah.
It's like this recipe for potential misinformation.
Especially given Lavrov's history of deflecting any criticism by claiming Russophobia. He's going to use that tactic again in this interview, isn't he?
Oh, absolutely. The analyst actually points out that Russophobia has become kind of this catch-all term to dismiss any legitimate criticism of Russia's actions. Right? It's a way to shift the blame, play the victim, and avoid any kind of accountability.
It's kind of a convenient way to shut down conversation. But the global reaction to what Russia is doing isn't based on, some irrational fear.
Right.
It's based on real concerns about human rights violations and, breaches of international law.
Precisely. And the analyst really suggests that this is a key point to keep in mind. When we're listening to anything Lavrov has to say, he's going to try to frame any opposition as Russophobia, but the reality is far more complex than that.
Okay, so how do we unpack Lavrov's rhetoric then? The analyst calls him a master of deceit.
It's a strong statement.
It is a strong statement.
But they back it up
Yeah.
by highlighting Lavrov's, consistent denial of any aggressive intentions toward Ukraine, even when all the evidence pointed to the contrary.
Right.
Basically, they're saying he's really good at using language to obfuscate and manipulate, creating a narrative that serves the Kremlin, regardless of what the truth actually is.
So then how do we, as viewers, as citizens, just trying to make sense of all this, how do we even begin to figure out what's genuine and what's manipulation?
The analyst emphasizes the importance of understanding Lavrov's tactics.
Right.
He's probably going to present himself as this very reasonable diplomat who's just seeking dialogue.
Okay.
But they really urge us to remember his track record. Listen for those subtle shifts in language, the deflection, the attempts to frame the narrative in a way that benefits Russia.
It's like we need a whole new set of listening skills.
You could say that.
To navigate this kind of information landscape.
Yeah, we need to be much more aware of the potential for manipulation. And I'm not talking just from figures like Lavrov, but from anyone with an agenda, right? It's about being critical, not cynical.
And that brings us, I think, to the central question about this whole interview. Is it a genuine attempt at dialogue? Or is this just another calculated move in this larger information war that's going on?
The analyst seems to be leaning towards the latter. They're concerned that Carlson, maybe unwittingly, is providing Lavrov with a really powerful platform to spread misinformation and further his agenda.
It's a troubling thought, especially when you consider the potential consequences. But we'll dive into that more in just a bit. First, let's take a closer look at this comparison that the analyst makes about Russia being like a mafia operation.
Okay.
It's a pretty striking analogy, and I'm curious to hear more about what exactly they mean by that.
Yeah, it's not just some, colorful comparison.
Yeah.
It actually gets at the heart of how this analyst sees power functioning in Russia. They're saying that this image that Russia projects of, a legitimate state engaged in diplomacy, that's all carefully constructed.
It's a facade.
It's a facade.
So you're saying that what we see on the surface, the treaties, the UN addresses Lavrov doing these interviews, that's not where the real decisions are being made.
That's what the analyst argues.
Yeah.
They're saying it's much more about control and, enrichment of those in power. And they point specifically to the role of the oligarchs.
Okay.
Those individuals with, immense wealth and influence
Right.
as being key players in this mafia system.
That makes me think about those sanctions that were imposed on a lot of those oligarchs after the invasion of Ukraine. Was that an attempt to kind of disrupt this power structure that the analyst is talking about?
Yeah, it's possible.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to remember, this analyst defected, right? They've got firsthand insight into how this system operates.
Right.
And they suggest that these oligarchs aren't just, passively wealthy. They're actively exerting control, often through means that are, maybe not so legal.
Shady dealings.
Yeah, exactly. And their interests are very much intertwined with the Kremlin's interests.
So if that's really the case, then diplomacy as we traditionally understand it might not be very effective when you're dealing with Russia.
That's a key takeaway here, yeah. The analyst argues that those traditional diplomatic channels that, rely on good faith and transparency,
Right.
they might just not work when you're dealing with a system like this.
Okay.
They're suggesting that understanding this mafia mentality is absolute crucial for crafting any kind of effective response.
That's a sobering thought. So if we circle back to Carlson in this interview, how does this perspective inform how we should understand what might happen?
Well, the analyst is worried that Carlson, with his platform and his audience, could be, maybe unwittingly playing into this mafia system. By giving Lavrov this platform, he's essentially legitimizing this facade of governance that we were just talking about.
So even if Carlson is going in with good intentions, the very act of interviewing Lavrov on his terms could be problematic.
Exactly. The analyst warns against giving legitimacy to these figures who are potentially using this appearance of diplomacy to mask their true intentions.
And that makes me think about what the analyst said earlier about how there wouldn't be a war if real diplomacy was actually happening.
Yeah, it's all connected. The analyst is painting this picture of a system where power operates in the shadows, where the rules of engagement are completely different, and where those traditional diplomatic approaches might just be totally ineffective.
And Lavrov is a master at navigating this system, right? You mentioned earlier how he's been deflecting criticism and denying things for years.
Absolutely. And the analyst suggests that this interview could be another opportunity for him to manipulate the narrative. He'll probably present himself as, this little diplomat seeking dialogue, but they caution us to remember his track record. Listen for that subtle language, the deflections, those attempts to frame the narrative in a way that benefits Russia.
So we really need to be careful not to fall into that trap of thinking that this is just a standard interview between a journalist and a foreign minister.
Right.
There's this whole other layer of context here that we have to keep in mind.
Exactly. And that's why I think the analyst's insights are so valuable here. They're giving us a framework for understanding the potential dangers of this interview, the potential for manipulation and the need to be critical in how we consume information.
It's a lot to process. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about the potential consequences of this interview. What are the analyst's main concerns?
It's interesting because on the one hand, you could say any platform for dialogue is valuable, especially in a situation as tense as this one.
But on the other hand, there's this huge potential for spreading misinformation. So what does the analyst say about the potential fallout from this interview?
They see it as a high-risk scenario.
Okay.
The biggest concern is that Carlson's audience, especially those who already have doubts about mainstream sources, might just take Lavrov's words at face value. And that could really inadvertently advance Russia's agenda, even if Carlson doesn't mean for that to happen.
So it's not just about what Lavrov says, it's about who is listening to him.
Exactly. The analyst points out that Russia's gotten really sophisticated with their propaganda efforts.
Oh, yeah.
They're targeting specific groups with messages that are tailored just for them.
So it's not just like a generic
No, it's very strategic.
propaganda blast.
Yeah, they're planting seeds of doubt and distrust very carefully.
And those seeds could take root pretty easily in an audience that's already primed for that kind of messaging. It's kind of unsettling to think about how easily we can be manipulated,
Yeah.
especially when we're getting information from sources that we trust.
Absolutely. The analyst actually highlights this as one of the biggest challenges we face in this whole information landscape.
Yeah.
It's not always about outright lies. It's these subtle distortions, omissions, framing techniques, things that can sway our opinions without us even realizing it's happening.
So how do we protect ourselves? Do we just stop trusting any source of information?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The analyst doesn't say we should become completely cynical or distrustful of everything,
Okay.
but they do encourage us to sharpen our critical thinking skills.
So question our assumptions.
Exactly. And seek out diverse perspectives.
So it's not about shutting down. It's about becoming more discerning about what we consume.
Precisely. Recognizing that everyone has biases, even ourselves,
Right.
and being willing to challenge those biases by looking for information that might contradict our views.
That's tough though, right? Especially these days where it feels like everyone's in their own echo chamber,
Yeah.
surrounded by people who already agree with them.
It is. It's easy to get stuck in those patterns.
But the analyst says stepping outside of those echo chambers is crucial for developing a more nuanced and informed perspective.
Okay. So how do we do that?
Well, they suggest, seeking out sources that we might not typically agree with, engaging in, respectful dialogue with people who hold different views,
Yeah.
and constantly questioning our own assumptions.
It's like we have to become our own fact checkers.
In a way, yeah. You got to constantly evaluate the information you're taking in.
Wow. Well, you've definitely given us a lot to think about today. This whole situation with Carlson and Lavrov is a perfect example of how complex this information landscape has become. It's not always easy to figure out what's true and what's not. But like you said, the responsibility really falls on us to be informed and engaged citizens.
I think that's a great way to put it. And I think the analysts' insights are so valuable here. They give us this framework for navigating this really challenging terrain.
Being aware of the potential for manipulation, sharpening those critical thinking skills,
Yeah.
and recognizing that the pursuit of truth is an ongoing process. It never really ends.
Well said. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for everyone to ponder. If truth is becoming more and more subjective, and the lines between information and manipulation are getting blurrier, what role do we each play in shaping a more informed and responsible media landscape? That's something I think we all need to consider as we navigate this increasingly complex world.
Couldn't agree more.
Well.
And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep diving deeper.